Good morning, my people of the internet. Welcome to another edition of Smack Talk. I am your host, James Cervone, and we have our debaters.
I'm Jacob Stevens.
Jacob Shuler.
And I'm Madisen Dietz.
Now, before we start this episode, I'm going to send a quick warning to you all out there. Today's topic might be a little graphic for you. Speaking of, realism versus stylized graphics. It's always a big debate, always people on the internet arguing about whether a game should look more realistic. Well, today, we're going to be talking about that ourselves. We have our realism over here. How about you start for us?
All right. So for realism, we've been progressively moving towards how realistic games can look. This is a bad example. This is very horrifying back there. But basically, there are games that show how realistic we can get. There's The Last of Us. There is Beyond Two Souls. Have you guys played that?
I haven't gotten that myself.
Thankfully, no.
It's a very good game. I highly recommend it. But like the realistic points that you're talking about, even beyond that, all of this, like with the virtual reality, with like the Oculus Rift and the Sony version, I forgot what it was called.
And the HTC Vive.
PlayStation VR.
Yeah, the VR and the HTC Vive. Like, it's all about realism for the most part. Yes, there are games with like, you know, cartoony graphics and mostly for fun, but there are games like the Mount Everest one where you're literally climbing Mount Everest, and it's supposed to be the most realistic possible thing that you can do because like maybe 2% of the population of the world is going to be able to get to the peak of Mount Everest. So.
All right. I heard you mention earlier, as we have been going on with time, our realism has been getting more and more. Got me thinking, so how's that going to look in 10 years, though? Can we look at any past examples, maybe to see where the problems can be on realism, or?
And then we'll just have the holodeck, and we're just going to be that far ahead. But like how realism goes, what we have to look at is like how much have we progressed at looking at realism from, let's say, the time video games have started to now, and where we'll be in about 10 years.
I mean, do you think we're going to be able to make that type of jump in progress in the next 10 years?
Absolutely. Look at how much of a jump we've made since, put the 90s, for example. Look how much of a jump we've made from that. We went from 2D, we went from Pong to what's now VR headsets.
Pong came out in the 70s, though, not the 90s.
Just let it happen.
You know what else came out in the 90s with realistic graphics? The first 3 Resident Evil games. Tell me how well those have aged.
Hasn't Phantasmagoria
People
also
still
come out?
like those games.
I'm not saying they're bad, I'm just saying they aged horribly. And that was filmed with human actors, so I don't think that would count in that kind of debate. At least the first one was. I don't know about the sequel.
Right.
Well, Until Dawn and Heavy Rain were also filmed like with realistic actors, but using the.
No, when I say
that was mocap.
When I say Phantasmagoria was filmed, I mean like they set up cameras and were literally recording actors on a soundstage, not motion capture.
Oh, okay.
Like, because that was a thing back in the 90s for some reason.
Oh, we're still talking about 90s games. Okay.
Right. Well, we've gone over a bit of the looks. Looks like we've gotten a good opinion on that so far. Something that's always bothered me about it, I've always felt stylized graphics has always been my thing, of course. I always feel like it's added a bit more of a freedom to gameplay. I feel like the realism can kind of limit, you know, what exactly are we allowed to push the limits of with this game? Do you think realism really limits any of the possibilities for a gameplay?
No, not at all. Because think about it. Let's name some of the games that we have that. How about VR games? Because that's one of our biggest things of immersion and realism. Because realism and immersion go hand in hand.
Right.
So let's think about some of the games. The Brookhaven Experiment. There's the Mount Everest one. There is
The Until Dawn.
Until Dawn. There's Space Pirate Trainer, which is just fun, even though it's not realistic. It has a sense of like how well it looks, how realistic it can look as a sci-fi game.
What about Aliens Colonial
Batman
Marines?
Arkham one?
That's on VR?
Well, no.
The Batman Arkham game is on VR now.
No, they have a VR experience for Batman on the, I think it's only on the PS4 at the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's
But
more
still,
of an immersion.
It's in a comic universe, but it's with stylized graphics. So you actually, there's a point where you're actually standing in the middle of Gotham and you can see the detail that was put into like all the buildings. Like you can see how some of them are rotting. You can see like broken windows and things like that.
That's trying to combine both, a little bit of both stylized and realism.
But that's a comic basis in a realistic format. So essentially that's breaking all the limitations that would have been put on realism, because realism doesn't extend to what could actually happen in the world. It's just extending to realistic graphics, so to speak.
Now, for the graphics, I always get this. I've always argued with my friend. He's always said that games are better off with realism, of course. Do you think a stylized game is objectively worse simply because it's not aiming for the realism? Do we have any thoughts on that, guys?
Absolutely not. I prefer realistic graphics, but that's only because I'm an artist by trade, and realism is just the kind of art form that I tend to lean towards. But stylistic graphics have their own pros as well, because they're fun to look at. It's amusing to watch like stylistic kind of graphics, even from like block characters to the cartooniest of things.
Yeah.
So. What games does he play? Your friend?
Let's see. Usually RPGs, Xbox. He's definitely a PC gamer himself, so.
All right.
PC Master Race, of course, on his side.
Do you like does he like Borderlands 2 or anything like that?
Yeah.
All right.
Overwatch,
Okay.
Extremely realistic looking games, I see.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
I've always
Borderlands
gotten the
2,
main
that
complaint.
looks so realistic with the outlining that you can see, the black lines on them. It's a stylized game.
So does that mean we win if he's siding with us now?
No, I'm not siding with him. I'm just saying that his friend clearly does not.
His main point was always complaining about Wind Waker being too cheery, colorful, and kiddish of a game.
It's a Legend
But
of
have
Zelda
you-
game. What are you going to expect
have
from
you
that?
2 words, Twilight Princess.
Good counterpoint there.
I mean,
That
that
is
was
one of the only games, though.
I've
besides
always.
Skyward Sword, besides that one.
True.
They have a separate, it's almost two separate genres that they have, for realism and the stylized. It's more like when Link's
Well, that's
a
getting into
child,
this-
it's more stylized.
That's
but
getting
when-
into the Zelda timeline, and
God,
Man, can we
no,
talk- that'll be
no,
another
no, no,
discussion.
no. The last thing I want to do is go over the Zelda timeline. It's not even a timeline. It's a parallel universe.
I know one of the biggest concerns for me, I've always enjoyed stylized more. It always made more of a, I've always had more of a connection to the characters. True realism can add to the immersion, but so many of the stylized games I played, Wind Waker, there's so much facial expression, so much clarity of emotion from the characters. I really feel like you can feel what the character's going through on their adventure.
To be fair, that was the one Zelda game that they actually let Link show emotion instead of just blank slate, tabula rasa.
I don't know, did you
and
play
blank
Phantom
slate.
Hourglass or the Spirit Tracks games?
You mean the games that also aped its aesthetic style, because Phantom Hourglass was a sequel and Spirit Tracks was set in the same timeline?
Yeah. Hero of Trains.
That was one of the first Zelda games I played. I chose a weird one to start with.
All right.
Nor
I
in the
started
side
with
games
Minish
of the
Cap.
Zelda.
That one's horribly stylized.
I mean, personally, as someone with an animation background, I tend to prefer stylized games just because of how much more expression it can get. For instance, I'm a fan of Arc System Works fighting games like BlazBlue and Guilty Gear. Each character in BlazBlue has at least 10,000, individual frames of animation for all of their specials, all of their character things, and you just can't pull that off in 3D very well. Look at Guilty Gear Xrd Sign and Revelator on the PS4. Yes, they did it, but it just doesn't have the same aesthetic, oh god, this is hurting my eyes to look at type deal.
You have the wrong outlook on it. They can't pull that off yet. They will be able to pull it
I
off.
mean, they've come pretty close because the new Guilty Gear game I didn't even know was 3D.
Let's think about it like this. I'm going to bring in a small other topic, is just to point it out. VR and AR.
All right.
AR, we're going to see it's augmented reality. So we see that there's things that change what we see in the reality. So take the HoloLens, for example. That's AR. We can see, they had a commercial for it, where they had Minecraft. They had the game building up, that's on top of it.
But that was a sizzle reel at a games conference, so I highly doubt it'll actually look like that when it comes to the market.
No, it's going to take some work, but it's getting there. But my point is that we're coming close to making it so realistic that you won't be able to tell the difference.
All right. question for me on my side. I know we've already gone over the whole limit of gameplay on it, but to further expand on that, I know you could say it doesn't really limit it, but could we really make a game like Zelda, like Mario, any of those games, not particularly the exact same franchise, but are we able to make a genre like that in realism?
Not really, because the stylized art of like the entire Mario series and the Zelda series, no matter which art style you choose, that is like the trademark of that series. Because if you put like a humanistic like Zelda or anything, like say the Zelda form that's used in Smash 4, if you use that in a game, it doesn't look quite right, because the Zelda and Link are supposed to be like very cartoony, very like big-headed almost, that type of thing.
I mean, I could even counterpoint that argument for the realism side by saying games like Twilight Princess really do get to capture that in a sense. Like, we're getting a little bit towards the realism. Of course, it's still stylized. It's still a Nintendo game, but
Every game has a little bit of stylized in it, regardless if it's supposed to be realism or not. But the question is, are we going to prefer realism over stylized? Or are we going to want more?
Back to the point, this is scary.
That's
I was about to say, this is
there's a reason that
perfect
things stay
segment.
stylized. This is the reason.
This is scary.
This is what nightmares are made of.
I almost forgot about him, honestly. There's a good example of maybe taking realism a little too far into different genres.
Yeah, so, but
Because I would say the closest platformer realism I may have experienced, if anyone's played Mirror's Edge, I feel like that can be a very
so
perfect
amazing.
example for your case in realism. You're getting towards the realistic graphics. Obviously, it's much more colorized.
Have you tried
Style.
Catalyst?
I have not tried Catalyst myself yet.
Catalyst, it uses more or less the same type of graphics, but it enhances them so much, and it looks incredible because it's realistic, because more or less on the side of physics realistic, but it looks so realistic. It's incredible. You think that you're jumping from a building, barely grabbing the pipe, having to climb up it, jump to another building, and then trying to escape from helicopters, other runners, people like that.
I have one more question I just thought of. Because I just thought of the game. Remember the Order 1886? So,
Yes,
a
unfortunately.
perfect example. I feel like with realism, is it worth pursuing realism to give up some other credits to the game?
I mean, I don't think
No.
Order 1886 was trying to be realistic so much as it was trying to be a movie, and at about 4 hours long, it did in fact succeed in that regard.
All right.
It was trying to be a game. Like, what it did was show us just how far we can push the limits to realism.
I mean, I'd argue Uncharted does that better, because Naughty Dog is probably the best at that Sony has.
As great, as much as I love Uncharted, Uncharted is a great game series. The Order took it to a different level. As bad as the enemies were, and the dialogue, and the story,
And the characters.
the characters,
but it's a great series.
but
All one game in the
of
series.
the Order of 1886. What my point is that they had so many realistic looking parts into it that it showed that we can still keep taking it to new heights, going beyond and on and on.
People
with
were
no
saying,
limit.
People were saying the same thing about Final Fantasy of Spirits within 10 years ago, so
And I was actually about to ask that
back to me on
myself.
that.
Obviously, you're saying we're getting better and better with our realism. We're going to say in 10 years it'll look even better. Now, we're looking back on games that aimed for realism in their time. Obviously, some of them have not aged very well. Let's say we fast forward 20 years after that 10-year advancement. All right. So, a quick rebuttal on that. So, do you think in 20 years or so, do you think the games 10 years from now are going to still be aged well?
Depends on which games we look at.
And it depends on the company.
Do you feel like
won't
we're ever
name
going to
any
reach a
companies.
ceiling, a max limit for how real we can make it?
Not really, because yes, there is limits to what actually is in our real world. But as far as like textures go, you can use realistic textures to create all sorts of like fantasy and sci-fi type of objects. So you can push the limits as far as you like.
Not only that, but you got to think of like fantasy games that take things that aren't real and how realistic they could look. Like take Skyrim for example. Like some of the creatures, like the the orcs, the Khajiit, you could, how real can you make that look?
True.
Things that aren't real that you could make look almost as real as you can reach out and touch them, that's what realism is.
All right. Well, I feel like we've gotten a very solid point from each side. I'll leave the rest up to you viewers. You've heard our opinions. You can leave yours in the comments as well. Thank you for joining us of another edition of Smack Talk. We'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, my friends.
Bye. Don't listen to any more of his jokes.